welcome you to the 2024 Annual Report to Congress release. I'm Randy Shriver. I'm standing in for our chair, Robin Cleveland, who is disappointed not to be here for the release today, but asked me to open the proceedings here. Let me start by noting that our report is once again a report with bipartisan consensus. Our report offers 32 recommendations to Congress to safeguard Americans' security and economic opportunity, and we've identified within that report 10 key recommendations. I want to briefly talk about some of the economic aspects of our findings and recommendations, and then Vice Chair Reva Price will talk about some of the security and foreign affairs issues before opening it up to questions. Since being anointed chair and general secretary, Xi Jinping has intensified efforts to control the public, the party, the economy, and state institutions within China. And in the face of slowing economic growth, rather than make needed structural changes to the economic model, the CCP has tightened its control over its economy and doubled down on export-led growth, raising global concerns about a China shock 2.0. China is also throwing resources behind developing advanced technology in a bid to dominate future technologies and increase external dependence on China, while also reducing its dependency on the United States and allied technologies, while seeking to improve its military capabilities. China has expanded investment and is accelerating efforts in multiple areas, including semiconductors, AI, quantum technologies, and biotechnology. Thus, our report offers recommendations in a lot of key policy areas in accordance with these developments, including how to enhance export controls on information and communications technology, outbound investment reviews, and coordination of strategy with partners. We are, of course, in the midst of political transition in the Congress and in the administration, and it is our hope that our bipartisan effort can help inform the discussions as we go forward and give Congress some guidance and advice on how to address this ongoing challenge from People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party. If I could invite Vice Chair Price to address security and foreign affairs issues.
Thank you, Commissioner Shriver, for your remarks and for pinch hitting today. And even though she can't be with us today, I want to thank Chairman Cleveland for all of her work during the past year. I've learned a great deal from her experience, and I'm very appreciative of the thoughtful leadership she has provided to the Commission. I would also like to thank my colleagues, our expert witnesses who have shared their insights with us over the course of the year, and very importantly, the excellent and indefatigable staff. As the Commission has found over many years, China's ambitions represent a persistent and multifaceted challenge to the United States, its allies and partners, and the international rules-based order. This year's annual report details China's efforts to assert itself internationally while strengthening its own capabilities and readiness for competition or conflict with the United States and allies. In 2024, China continued its campaign to build international influence by claiming to be the country most able to bring about a fair and equitable global order. Yet behind China's self-declared quest for quote-unquote globalization and multipolarization, it is a desire to ensure its own dominance. The leadership in Beijing is prepared to leverage persuasion, manipulation, and coercion in order to advance its own agenda. And, make no mistake, its agenda is not about combating injustice or improving lives in what China's leaders now call the Global South. Xi's agenda is about control and opportunity for the Chinese Communist Party. For example, in the Middle East, China professes to support security even while failing to protect international shipping in the Red Sea. China also is a key supporter of one of the most destabilizing forces in the Middle East, buying 90% of Iran's sanctioned oil, meaning it effectively pays for almost half of Iran's entire government budget. General Secretary Xi insists that China is a partner for Europe, yet China continued providing large-scale support for Russia's war machine, with NATO labeling China a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine. China has also shielded the Russian economy from international sanctions. With the United States, China's leadership professes interest in de-escalation while refusing to take responsibility for any of its own destabilizing actions. China's willingness to use coercion is most visible in the Indo-Pacific, where the People's Liberation Army and China Coast Guard are using escalation tactics against Taiwan, the Philippines, Japan, and others to assert China's interests through intimidation. Specifically, this year, the China Coast Guard resorted to violence against Philippine personnel operating within their country's own exclusive economic zone. In 2024, China tried to influence Taiwan's democratic elections, and PLA aircraft have already violated Taiwan's air defense identification zone over 2,300 times, the highest number on record, and more than 100 times the number of such flights recorded in 2019. China also launched its first intercontinental ballistic missile test into the South Pacific in more than 40 years. At the same time, China continues to tighten political control within its own borders. The CCP is intensifying political discipline within the party and enforcing whole-of-society adherence to an ever-expanding vision of national security. In Hong Kong, Beijing continues to deepen an environment of self-censorship, uncertainty, and fear through enforcement of the national security law and this year's Article 23 ordinance. Residents and businesses in Hong Kong can no longer trust that their freedoms and rights will be upheld by the city's legal system or law enforcement. In fact, today's sentencing of 45 pro-democracy leaders clearly emphasizes this point. Political control is just one way that Beijing is trying to insulate itself from risk. China is stockpiling large quantities of critical resources and continuing its long-standing efforts to sanction-proof its economy. Militarily, China is streamlining its defense mobilization system to give the PLA greater access to local resources, reserves, and civilian talent. Finally, China continues to build up its own military and technological strength. China's military is advancing its capacity for surveillance, intelligence, and reconnaissance, as well as its electronic warfare capabilities, which can be used alongside its missile arsenal to threaten and attack U.S. or allied forces in any conflict in the Indo-Pacific region. Against this backdrop, U.S. efforts to ensure our own continued competitiveness alongside those of our allies and partners will be critical in protecting both our own interests and international security. In the recommendations from this year's annual report, we highlight potential avenues that Congress can take to address these and other challenges. Thank you, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Vice Chair Price. We have 8 commissioners present for this session.
I think we can start with a virtual question. Jonathan can read that from one of our virtual participants.
So we'll start with a 2-part question, one from Hiroaki and one from Ed. In what ways has China supported Russia in its aggression against Ukraine, both directly and indirectly, such as in trade in gas and oil? The second question is, how could the United States and China cooperate to convince President Putin to end the war right now and go?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to jump in. Thanks. I'm John Stivers. One of the ways that China is specifically supporting Russia is through sanctions evasion and laundering of illicit finance through Hong Kong and Chinese banks. And what we found in the report is a lot of detailed analysis of how sanctions are being evaded through both Chinese and Hong Kong banks to get advanced technology and other weapons to Russia.
Thank you. I'd just add to that, there is indirect support through Chinese agreements to purchase more Russian oil and other Russian goods. The more direct support there has been material contribution to Russia's military weapon systems, including what now looks to be, and this would be post-report, the most recent reporting is the Europeans have suggested they have evidence that Chinese-made drones, rather than just component parts, are being discovered on the battlefield. So the trajectory seems to be increasing support for Russia. I don't know if anybody wants to address the diplomacy question. I think that's that's for a future administration to determine, and I don't know that we have any specific recommendations in this report or any specific thoughts we'd want to share on that. Unless.
This is actually not on that point, prior point. The question of China's motivations in supplying the kind of assistance that it has to Russia, touch on this in the report. It appears that from a Chinese perspective, it's advantageous to have the United States and our allies preoccupied with events in the European theater rather than being able to focus as heavily Asia as we might otherwise do. It also appears to be the case that China has taken advantage of Russia's situation, its inability to export to the West, to get very advantageous terms, as Commissioner Shriver mentioned, for energy, grain, and other goods. And in doing that, China also potentially reduces its own vulnerability to sanctions or other kinds of limitations on its ability to export in the event of a conflict with.
Commissioner Kuiken, did you have a thought? No. Okay.
On the Russia part of it, we have two recommendations that I think impact this. The first of which is that we recommend sanctioning particular Chinese and Hong Kong banks of which there's evidence that illicit finance and support is being provided to Russian entities, particularly the Russian military. And the second is to label Hong Kong a jurisdiction of primary money laundering concern due to the illicit finance that is going through Hong Kong with the tacit support of Beijing and the Hong Kong government. And we believe both of those recommendations, if considered by the Congress and the administration, would go a long way on cracking down on a lot of that support to Russia.
Hi, thanks for holding this. Merrily International Trade Today. I had questions about some of your economic recommendations. On the ending PNTR, the way you've written it does not seem to suggest that you are saying immediately go to column 2 tariffs or go to at least a 35% tariff on the things that are tariff-free in column 2, as Senator Thune's bill and Representative Molinar's bill suggest. So I wondered if you would talk on your views on what ending PNTR would really mean in terms of tariffs. And then also, I saw your recommendation that CBP and Commerce develop tools capable of identifying the origin of components and materials in goods that are not of Chinese origin. And I wondered if you would elaborate on, do you see that as a first step towards tariffing the value added from China in goods that are substantially transformed elsewhere?
So repealing PNTR would basically provide the president the authority to revisit China's most favored nation status under U.S. law. As you point out, it wouldn't automatically trigger on its own an increase in tariffs. It would give the president the authority to adjust tariffs, which PNTR cemented at a statutory way. The president, I think, deserves the flexibility to recalibrate America's trading relationship with China. Every year since the founding of this commission, the conclusion has been that China has failed to live up to its WTO commitments. It hasn't done so in all 23 years of being part of the WTO. I think it's fair to assume that it's not going to start suddenly abiding by its commitments. It will never abide by its commitments, and therefore we need to take stock of that and recalibrate our relationship accordingly. We've seen the last generation has been, the lived experience of this country has been that not only are giving China PNTR and MFN has caused what some people have called the China shock and has been devastating economically to a substantial number of communities in this country. But since COVID, we've also seen the national security implications of being industrially over-reliant on China. And so the goal of this recommendation was to give the United States president the authority to readjust that moving forward on an annual basis.
I will thank you so much for your question. I'm going to go to the part 2 of your question related to Homeland Security, CBP, and commerce. Coordinating to better assess tools that can be used for origin verifications. This hearing that I co-chaired with my colleague, the chairwoman Robin Cleveland, looked at unsafe products coming into the United States and also legal transshipment, and touching on Jacob's comments just now about Chinese products washing onto the world stage. Obviously, they're trying to export their way out of some of the economic crisis that they are facing internally. So this recommendation to Congress is we need these agencies to coordinate to ensure that there's not misclassification of goods, duty evasion, illegal transshipment, to ensure that the component parts.
To add, this would also have national security implications. The United States is seeking to bar or limit importation of a variety of products, materials, components as part of a larger strategy for developing alternative sources of supply. It's necessary to identify where, in fact, items that are being imported originate. Two-level problem. One is the sort of simple transshipment through Vietnam or some other country. And then there's another layer to the problem, is that China is an enormous producer of so-called intermediate goods, which find their way into all kinds of manufactured products that eventually find their way into the United States. So we wanted to limit that, whether for economic or strategic reasons. We need better tools for identifying the source of value-added materials that are in imports. And it's clear at this point that our ability to observe and to understand origin, true origin, the value-added, is limited. So that's the reason. Mike?
I think it's a step forward, but is sort of one vector or one product. We need to look at it across a variety of products. Has already been said. We have used, as you know, simple tariff shift or other rules in the past. Complexity of the supply chain, the changing nature of them requires that we be much more aggressive in getting the granular data, understanding of the trade flow. ICTS and the connected vehicles is, again, directed at one specific product, and we need much broader understanding of how to address these challenges.
Good morning. Thank you again for a rather comprehensive report. I'm going to focus a little bit on Chapter 4, the de minimis provision, specifically around slave and child labor, and the role of both Mexico and Canada in working with America to stop the flow of illicit goods into the United States through our borders. And if you can talk about how Congress can work with Canada and Mexico to ensure that they are actually working with the provisions that are in USMCA and also the Uyghur Forced Prevention Labor Act.
I'll start with the de minimis. So our commission's bipartisan report recommends to Congress to immediately eliminate de minimis exemption for any product coming in through the e-commerce. This is an important and critical recommendation. It is our top 2 in terms of recommendations this year. Just last year, there were 3 million de minimis shipments a day into the United States. Very little scrutiny, facilitating forced labor product, precursors that go into fentanyl, pill presses, It's trade that is exploding. This year, just to give you a sense of the trajectory, it's 4 million boxes a day, estimated to be 1.4 billion de minimis shipments over this past year, according to CBP. It is impossible to police what is in those boxes, and it is hurting trade partners like Canada and Mexico because warehouses have popped up in these countries and people are no longer sourcing products that are manufactured from these countries that may be using US components and instead facilitating Chinese products coming into the United States duty-free. So because of the alarming nature of de minimis, how much it has grown, in the 1930s, de minimis was created so we could bring back trinkets from abroad and not have to pay a tariff. In the e-commerce environment, it has become a funnel for Chinese products to receive duty-free, no scrutiny treatment, as well as other products around the world. So that is why the Commission looked at this very closely this year from a consumer product safety perspective. Everything from children's toys to makeup to pool filters that ended up killing people. There are some very serious consumer product safety risks and the inability to police these kinds of products coming in to the United States.
If I could just add a word, we're not going to have a fashion industry across the West if we keep these types of loopholes. It's very clear that platforms like Shein and Temu shop around the world to different fashion brands, steal all the designs, and then ship these products, copycats of these products, in 3 days, tax-free to customers around the West. And this is true in the United States. It's also true in many parts of Europe. And so we can either have a fashion industry or we can have de minimis, but we probably can't have both.
Just one other quick comment. I think, not only from, of course, the work of this commission, but I think you've seen in Congress with the UFLPA and the broad bipartisan support, we're still in the learning phases of how to track products, how to enforce the law, but also the need to expand dramatically, not only with Mexico and Canada, but other trading partners. Their recognition of the human rights violations that are occurring, and how best to get our allies and partners acting in tandem.
Just one other thing. The focus of the recommendation is obviously on the repeal of de minimis. The other critical part of the recommendation is also resourcing and personnel. If we're going to now repeal de minimis, there needs to be a dramatic increase in the number of personnel and the resources that we give them and the analytical tools that we give them to get after this in a real way, because undoubtedly there'll be some modification of shipping behaviors or something to make sure that there's workarounds for these firms. And that's going to require a lot of work on CBP's part, and so we have to think about that problem as well.
One additional comment is the EU is contemplating and moving forward with steps to eliminate de minimis altogether. Other countries like South Africa have already done that. Brazil has done that. Countries are adapting as a result of this kind of loophole.
I could add just one more thing. This is an example of something that occurs at several points in our report. The observation that most of the things that we contemplate to restrict outflows of technology, to restrict inflows of certain products and materials can best be implemented with the cooperation of friends and allies.
Uh, 2026, USMCA comes up for review. Will your recommendation be for Congress and in terms of negotiating, working more closely with Mexico and Canada to ensure that all the provisions and some of the recommendations here and in the report are implemented in those countries?
I think, again, from the work of our commission, the select committee, and many others, there's, I think, fairly unified interest in, a collective set of recommendations, whether the ones we're making or others. And I don't see any way that those issues won't be incorporated into the 2026 review.
Hi, thank you very much for doing this. My name is Valentina Pasquali, and I write about international business for Arabian Gulf Business Insight. So I was hoping you could articulate or provide some insight on how important the Middle East is becoming in all of this. Obviously, the region gets its own chapter, but anything more that you can say about just how much of a priority should be and a focus for the U.S. government in this situation?
I'd be happy to start. So we talked a little bit about the Chinese purchase of Iranian oil, the magnitude of that, and what that means in terms of the Iranian economy. But in fact, it, of course, goes well beyond that, because by extension, Iran is funding extremist terrorist organizations, Hamas, Hezbollah, involved in supporting the Houthis. So China's direct involvement in the region is a destabilizing one. They've tried to take credit for some of their diplomatic breakthroughs, which I think are much more modest than they've advertised in terms of what they were claiming to have accomplished in the diplomacy between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We've also found, and we've documented in the report, that the Middle East has become a region which the Chinese military is both more active and interested for future opportunities for deployment and access. And so activities off the Gulf of Aden, the anti-piracy activities have given the opportunity for more presence, but also operational experience. And their involvement in the region may ultimately expand through port access and cooperative agreements with some of the Gulf states. So it sort of runs across the whole spectrum of economic, security, military issues, and we think it bears closer scrutiny and consideration for the Congress. We have a couple recommendations, including one that addresses directly the purchase of Iranian oil, but also related to U.S. membership of the IMO and what should be demanded of China in terms of honoring commitments there. So it's something that does bear further watching.
We also noted that a number of countries in the Gulf have been interested in developing their technology, high technology capacity. Some of them envision themselves as future centers for artificial intelligence, and for that reason have been interested in importing from the United States and other countries in the West products that are necessary in order to build that kind of capability. And there's a concern about the possibility that some of that is going onwards and arriving in China. So this is something that has to be monitored carefully.
I think some of our findings are that China has benefited clearly from the U.S.-led security architecture, while at the same time it's pursuing its own narrow interests on economics and energy resources, and embedding its technology companies throughout the region, especially Huawei and 5G and telecommunications. And also, we found that we believe that China prefers to see the U.S. bogged down in the conflicts while they're able to pursue, again, their own narrow economic interests without, getting involved in some of the more difficult issues that would require sacrifice. And I think that, and they're not doing enough to help stabilize the region at this time, I think is one of our main conclusions.
I'd like to follow up on Commissioner Kuiken's comment about resources needed for eliminating de minimis. I've not had the benefit of reading the full report, but in the executive summary, I didn't see an economic impact analysis on what that would mean, both in terms of CBP resources, personnel, additional lanes, additional screening facilities, as well as the impact on private sector supply chains. Is that in the report? And if so, will that be submitted to the budgeteers as they prepare the FY26?
We did not get into that level of detail, but it's certainly something that needs to be considered.
Agree with Commissioner Kuiken. Just another point to note here is these de minimis entries are often coming in through air freight and individual packages in order to avoid paying a tariff or duty. Logically, a lot of this will go back to regular freight in terms of shipments because it is cost prohibitive to do that and pay a duty. And the other thing to just sort of note, while it's not in the commission report, we have over 50 trade agreement countries or trade preference programs where you can receive duty-free goods into the United States. So we didn't go into that level of analysis. It's a good question. Congress in the coming days will probably be looking at that a lot more closely.
The only thing I would just pile on here is, I don't think the commission views this year's recommendation as the last word. I think this is an area where, like warfare, there's a measure and a countermeasure, and that we're going to continue to need to sort of iterate on this and stay ahead of it. The commission, as Commissioner Wessel always reminds me, is a commission that sort of prided itself in some of the over the horizon type work, and that's an area. This is an area where I think the commission's continued focus is going to be important.
Hi, my name is Nikita Rai. I'm from Congressman Andy Kim's office. So I saw in this report that you talked a little bit about quantum information science, and I'd be curious to hear just, kind of what you found there. And in particular with our export controls regime, do you see any holes there as it relates to quantum?
I think quantum is a space where the commission did a good hearing on technology, and quantum was part of that conversation. This is an area of strategic competition, as well as biotech and artificial intelligence. There are a few other items that we talk about in the commission's report. Quantum is an area where there is incredible opportunity, and where I think we need to do sort of more work and research. And the initial findings of the commission, I think one of the 32 is that we need to continue to work on the export control side of the house, as well as work on the funding and resources in this space. I don't know if Jacob or Commissioner Wessel want to say anything.
I'd agree with all what Commissioner Kuiken said, and but also, this is a developing technology, as you well know, and so the cooling, all the various components that will serve the quantum infrastructure are still being developed, still being identified, and this is going to be a priority area, but one that's going to evolve.
This may also be a sector which would require restrictions on outbound investment. So if there's going to be more, or if there are going to be more restrictions on outbound investment from the United States in selected sectors, this is likely.
Commissioner Hallberg, anything? The one thing I just pulled a string on that Commissioner Wessel just mentioned in passing is, just like in the AI space, there's sort of a technology stack. The same thing is true in quantum information science. And so everyone sort of talks about the sort of future of quantum and all of the good things that it's going to bring. I don't think we often sort of do the analysis to unpack the various sub-technologies that make a quantum computer or other quantum capabilities. And so that's an area where we're going to have additional focus as well.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the time. I have a question regarding your recommendations 42 and 405, both in the strategic technology. Sure. Is this better? Thank you. So regarding your recommendations on page 172 for emerging technologies and pages 405 for the strategic geoeconomic section, with regards to the recommendation to limit investment into countries of concern and prohibiting outbound investment through a sector-based approach, how do you foresee this affecting investment writ large? Does this include greenfield investments? And if so, what do you see the supply chain effects to be? And then further, how do you foresee this, given that our countries of concern are relatively small or narrow in scope, how do you foresee this factoring in with countries that have agreements with other countries that we would otherwise deem safe? How do you see that third country effect factoring in, such as with Brazil, India, UAE, etc.?
I'll take it. As you may know, the commission a number of years ago identified outbound investment as a important objective to review and potentially screen. We've seen with the executive order additional steps being taken. I think we also saw Senate passed by, was it 96-3, I believe it was, the Casey Cornyn approach, and there'll be some language, I guess, in the NDAA, et cetera. You know, our first focus, of course, is countries of concern and where capital, technology, et cetera, are supporting the development of military critical technologies is the aperture at this point. But we in the past have also said it should be looking at issues like biotech, pharma, and a number of others. This is going to be an area where we're going to also have to engage our allies, as has been done with the EU through the Trade and Technology Council on both inbound and outbound. So it's going to be evolving, but our first priority is looking at capital and technology transfers from the U.S. and how they are advancing the potential military and adverse capabilities of those countries.
I think we have a question from one of our virtual participants.
This is a question from the Global Taiwan Institute. What do the commissioners think the 119th Congress should prioritize regarding Taiwan policy to enhance deterrence against the PRC, given the 2027 benchmark that Xi Jinping has directed for the PLA to have the capabilities to invade Taiwan?
Well, the Commission does a Taiwan chapter every year, and we've made recommendations over the years. This particular report does have a couple of recommendations that I think address the GTI question. One recommendation suggests that Congress amend the Arms Export Control Act to include Taiwan on the list of NATO Plus recipients. So this would add Taiwan to sort of the most elite category of security assistance partners and ease the process of export control review on potential transfers to Taiwan. But that, again, is part of a broader set of recommendations we've made over the years related to Taiwan, including addressing Taiwan's resiliency, including addressing our broader posture in the region. I guess I could mention another recommendation where we talk about the C4ISR and electronic warfare environment. Although it's not a recommendation that's directly about Taiwan, it's about U.S. posture in the region and how we're doing vis-a-vis China in this complex, dynamic environment. And we focused in a particular hearing on China's counterintervention strategy. Thanks to the contributions of expert witnesses, we narrowed down on this issue of C4ISR, counter C4ISR, EW, counter EW, as being a key thing to look at and understand where the competition is and where the gaps might be for the United States. So again, not directly about Taiwan per se, but about our posture in the region, which of course is key to the deterrence equation related to Taiwan.
Thank you for being here. Going back to security landscape, and I apologize if these questions are too niche. There's been reports of the past couple months of PLA activity or cooperation, possible PLA cooperation with Pakistan regarding security around their economic corridor. I was wondering if your commission investigation yielded any findings about that, and then also, again, within the last month or so, reports that of a possible kind of Djibouti-like security cooperation with the naval base in Cambodia. Again, just wondering if your commission had any findings regarding those two developments.
So as a region, we didn't look at South Asia specifically this time. We did in a previous report and have commented on China's military diplomacy, including key countries like Pakistan, but I don't think you'll find anything in the report about that particular issue of Chinese involvement in the economic corridor. The Chinese interest in Riyadh naval base, somebody's going to have to remind me if it's addressed in the year in review session. We didn't do a Southeast Asia portion this year. I think that may be something we address more closely in the coming year. But I think as part of the overall effort on the part of the PLA to expand access throughout the region and beyond, it's certainly something we have been interested in and have looked at, and I think it's something we'll investigate at a deeper level, perhaps even in the coming year.
I just want to add that we closed any changes in the report in the middle of October. So some of the very recent issues are obviously not addressed because we were done at that point, but they will inform what we work on next year.
Hi there. My name is Christiana, and I'm from Rep. Hageman's office. My question is regarding the developing nations within the Indo-Pacific. Recently, we've seen China kind of counter these countries utilizing public diplomacy and more coercive tactics. My question is, how much of an issue is this, and what would be the Commission's recommendations for the U.S.? Thank you.
Sure, I'll give this a shot. I mean, we didn't focus, again, most specifically on the Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific region this year. Our focus regionally was on Middle East. I know over the years we've made a number of recommendations regarding development finance and support for countries in the region. One of the specific recommendations on that is to create something called the Taiwan Allies Fund, which would specifically create a fund within our appropriations framework, which would surge support for those specific allies that are under a tremendous amount of pressure from China to switch their diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China. And so hopefully that recommendation can make some progress within the legislative session. But just in general, additional support, additional diplomatic engagement, additional development and security funding, I think, is something that over the years the Commission has been pretty strong on making those recommendations to those specific countries, especially the ones that are strategically important.
Just wanted to return to my memory was basically correct as my colleague helped me with the specific reference. So when you get your full copy of the report, which I'm sure you'll be done reading by the end of the day, page 134 in the year in review and in the security section, we talk about China's deepening relationship with Cambodia and their interest in military access in Cambodia. Not a recommendation that flows from it, but the analysis is there.
Let me also say that, certainly we've followed China's activities with many of the island nations. Not everything can be handled in every report. We met with State Department officials, I believe, 2 weeks ago to discuss this as well. So it is certainly within our scope and analysis, and I expect will be highlighted in upcoming reports.
Good morning. My name is Brogan. I have a question regarding technology and data privacy in the U.S. Since the U.S. doesn't have a comprehensive consumer data privacy law and Chinese hackers are an issue, do you recommend that we should adopt a policy similar to the GDPR, or what safeguards should Americans take in order to protect their data?
We have not gone to the level of data privacy in terms of GDPR or similar, approaches, or things like data localization, et cetera. We have highlighted over many years the threats from certain Chinese technologies, whether it was our work years ago with Lenovo and beaconing to current concerns about critical infrastructure. This year's report does refer to a certain number of technologies. So, for example, batteries that are used in as major storage or grid backup, which are remotely accessible, et cetera. So we have ongoing issues relating to Chinese technology, cyber intrusions, hacking, et cetera, but not the data integrity or data protection regimes, which we think, or I would simply suggest for myself, is probably subject for either a different commission or different entities, Commerce Committee, et cetera.
We didn't discuss this, but this may be another area where differences between the United States and our allies stand in the way of effective responses to things that China has.
Thank you all for the work that you've done, for answering questions today, and particularly to Vice Chair Price for clarifying the time span covered in this report. As you all know, the Chinese government, through their Ministry of Commerce, has recently updated China's own export controls, published a list of items, dual-use items in particular, that China now will seek to control. In the future, will your work look at China's retaliatory actions, beginning with everything from the CCC mark for certain software to China's anti-foreign sanctions law and, you know, this latest salvo, so to speak?
This is, as you just said, the latest salvo. So this is an issue that we have worked on for many years. The weaponization of supply chains, whether it was 2010, was it, with Japan and rare earths, I believe it was, or other technologies. And while we put this report to bed in October, late August, antimony and certain other activities. So we've looked at that for a long period of time. And part of our recommendations last year, this year, and prior to has been, how do we look at supply chains? How do we ensure that we have the resiliency, and how do we have the capacity to produce the goods that we need? So it has been an issue in the past, ongoing. I don't think this issue is going away.
One of the recommendations that we did make was for an attempt to overview all of the various policies the U.S. government is using, think about how they may be more effectively integrated. I think we're reaching a new level in this rivalry. China is beginning to do things that are more overt, their intent to harm our. We need to think how we respond to that in a coherent way.
I'm really glad to hear you say that. I agree with you on all the supply chain issues and, you know, the critical minerals, but I was really looking for, are you going to look comprehensively at Chinese policymaking in this area where they seek to, use your words, weaponize their economic policy, political, geopolitical relationship in an asymmetric?
I think the report does that to some extent. And I think you can expect the commission to continue to do that work next year. I think all of the recommendations are focused on trying to achieve part of that, you know, pieces of that, that overall objective. And like I said, next year we'll do more.
I think we have a question from a virtual participant online.
This question is from Erica. Congress banned TikTok, and the Biden administration took steps to ban Chinese connected vehicles. But there are millions of devices made in China installed all over the United States that are connected to the internet and capable of either gathering data on Americans or even creating kinetic effects in the real world. Does the Commission have any work and recommendations that address those vulnerabilities?
It is a potentially a whack-a-mole, to use a old analogy, but you know, this is an ongoing issue, just as the previous prior discussion on weaponization of supply chains. This year's report, as I mentioned just a moment ago, deals with connected batteries, et cetera, that serve major power sources, grid, industrial entities, et cetera. You know, we are looking, and we have in the past, through CISA and others, the threats to our critical infrastructure, as well as this commission many years ago had raised issues regarding Huawei and other technologies, and those technologies being a vector for espionage, electronic espionage. So we've opined in, I think it was 2 years ago, on IoT, et cetera. So it is a continuing effort to understand what the modalities and vectors, threat vectors are, what the attack surfaces are, to use the term of our military planners, and an ever-expanding concern.
We do have a specific recommendation actually calling for an expansion of the administration's current rulemaking efforts to include not only connected vehicles, but industrial machinery, other Internet of Things devices, appliances, other connected devices. So it's quite a broad recommendation.
I would just say that the Salt Typhoon revelations that have been publicly reported also show you that the United States government is still continuing to learn exactly where all the vulnerabilities are and starting to learn just how aggressive and invasive the Chinese actions are. And as the intelligence community learns more, as we learn more, you can continue to expect the Commission to do a lot of work here.
In just quickly reviewing the report this year again, you've moved into covering the whole of China's approach with respect to global hegemonic actions, and trade is ultimately facilitating the buildup of the military, as you've pointed out. Do you look at China's aggression here in their total hybrid warfare against America as something that we are capable of combating and addressing in the immediate now? And what further actions would you recommend to, again, put China back in its box? And I hate to say that, but we need to work with China, but we also need to make sure that they understand, some of the recommendations here in the hybrid warfare sphere. Do you think they're at war with us right now?
Well, I was just going to give a quick answer to that. I think they think they're at war with us and have for some time. I think we're beginning to take on board, accept this reality and respond appropriately, but we're still behind in what we're doing.
I also want to give great credit to, our men and women in uniform, their leadership, et cetera. I mean, yes, there are great threats, but I also think that it's not appreciated how much our government does to protect our interests, whether it's direct military threats, threats to critical infrastructure, or many other things. As Commissioner Keiken just said, with Salt Typhoon and other persistent threats, they're being identified on a daily basis, but they are being identified. It is a constant challenge, and the threats are great, not just from China, but other nation states and criminal actors. But we're doing a good job. We need to be vigilant always and look at every new threat and address it as quickly as possible.
I think we have more questions via uscc.gov.
There's a question from John. There has been a lot of talk about China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and other countries creating a new axis of some sort to challenge the United States, Europe, and the existing global order. What does the Commission's report tell us about the issue of growing concern?
Sorry. Well, we certainly are documenting it and watching with interest in terms of how this will unfold. We certainly see the North Korea contributions to Russia's efforts vis-a-vis Ukraine as being quite significant and additive to what the Chinese have been doing in the direct and indirect ways. I think at this stage, it's documentation and analysis. I think it is something we've already internally agreed to take on in greater depth in the coming year and probably next year's report as we learn more about the real implications of this access or potential access, however you want to describe it.
The examples, and again, it wasn't an explicit focus of our report for this year, but I think it's something we're going to look at next year. But there are numerous examples that have come to light just in the last year or even less that suggest the depth and complexity of the cooperation among these four actors, which I think was previously not fully understood. There is a question of how we're going to respond, but the Commission will certainly be interested in that from the China angle, and China plays a key role in this, albeit not always the one that's closest and most visible.
I think one of the main themes that you see throughout this report, and the reporting really the Commission's done for a long time, is that China has been trying to change the status quo. In the region, they keep pushing the envelope, trying to change the status quo, changing the balance of power, little by little with small, relatively small actions rather than a broad, one fell swoop change. You see this on the South China Sea, you see it with Taiwan every day, intellectual property rights, technology, every issue you see that. And again, one of the main themes is that one of the strongest assets the United States has is our strong network of alliances and partnerships in the region, and how important it is to continue that and to continue working together with the Europeans and in the region. I think you see that come across throughout the report, and it will be very important, especially in the next few years.
Regarding Hong Kong and where we foresee the changing shifts in structural power existing, as we look at China making these small movements, as you said, Commissioner, do we expect, one, to see more non-traditional collectors coming as we look to do overall structural crackdowns on tech transfer? Additionally, regardless of if we do or we don't, do we foresee additional extraterritoriality being leveraged through various systems of the CCP to target U.S. entities such as students, citizens, or others that might be looking to promote Hong Kong independence or sovereignty or something like that, especially given recent crackdowns, which I know are not covered in the report?
Well, with regard to Taiwan, regard to Hong Kong, you see the intensification of the repression over the last 4 or 5 years since the national security law that was imposed on Hong Kong has just changed the character of what was once a vibrant, free city where commerce could flow and be a real link between for around the world. And you see that the situation's deteriorated, not just in terms of human rights and freedom, but the business climate. And you see so many businesses are leaving for Singapore, or that are intimidated because they can't work, they fear working openly, or even moving forward with negative economic data to the extent that that could become a criminal offense. Consistent with Article 23, which we report on, that's happened over the last year. But you definitely see the chilling impact on business and on freedom in Hong Kong. And again, we have a number of recommendations that get at that issue a little bit.
I think we have another question via uscc.gov.
Why is it important that the U.S. develop artificial general intelligence, also known as AGI, before China? And will current export controls prevent China from producing AGI before the U.S.?
I think, as the report says, being the first mover on artificial general intelligence is critical. If the Chinese government were to get there first, I think the United States will find itself at a perpetual strategic disadvantage. And that makes it an imperative to sort of race to be to the front of the line on this one. And that's the Commission's top recommendation.
Regarding the Middle East, I would love to hear your thoughts on the idea from Saudi Arabian perspective that their relationship with China serves as sort of balancing act against China's relationship with Iran, and that the greater cooperation that Saudi Arabia can foster with China, the sort of less so that Iran is able to gain from China in their relationship. And then separately, I was wondering, again, your reaction to the limits on the Iranian-Chinese relationship, as China has supported them to a point. The report discusses this a little bit, but China wants to resolve or revise the international current order, but Iran serves as a destabilizing force in the region. So is there kind of a natural cap to that relationship because China will support them up into a point that they become a greater destabilizing force around that is in the region?
I think in the most general way, in our hearing on the Middle East and testimony, think our conclusion was that China had an interest, in a sense, in keeping the pot boiling, but not have it boil over. Benefit from turmoil that preoccupies the United States, but they fear conflict which would disrupt their relations with nations in the region and could also disrupt their access to energy. So they have a delicate line to walk. You mentioned Saudis and the Iranians. China has clearly tried to maintain good relations with both, and there's a tension in that, but they seem to have succeeded thus far in being able to do it.
In regards to Iran, I think one of the main findings is that that China has considerable leverage over Iran, and it's an unbalanced relationship. I think that China's purchases constitute, I think someone said this earlier, nearly half of Iran's entire government budget. They don't have any other friends who can provide the same sort of economic support that China can. So it's a very unbalanced relationship. China can get what they want from Iran, but they're also not using their leverage on Iran when it comes to trying to stabilize the region, which one would think would be in their interests. But their interests are multifaceted, including having the United States be bogged down in the region. And regarding Saudi Arabia, I mean, I think what you also see in the report is that Saudi Arabia is trying to diversify outside of oil and technology is the key place, advanced technology, the key place to go. And that's really the main, the key part of that relationship with China and Saudi Arabia.
I think we have another question online.
Is China preparing for war? What evidence do we have?
Well, we did do a hearing on China's preparations and ways that they were trying to make their economy more resilient, their vulnerabilities less significant in the potential case of conflict where we might try to leverage our position of dominance in certain areas. So I think if I could try to generalize the findings, that China's doing a number of things that would be consistent with moving to a war footing, but at this stage, that could also be explained by China taking steps to be more resilient in the case of increasing economic pressure from the West, increasing sanctions. So there's not a clear determination that they are definitely moving on a war footing because of this, potential convergence of war footing or resilience. So therefore, we did have a recommendation that Congress direct the Office of Director of National Intelligence within 180 days to conduct a classified assessment and brief its findings to the Congress that looks at these various indicators and warnings. And the assessment should include, but not limited to, China's energy storage locations, stockpiling rates, particularly for crude oil, coal, and natural gas, production shifts from civilian to military industries, China's national defense mobilization system, and China's strategic reserves and their compositions and locations. And there's a bit more in there, but I think our basic assessment is there are a number of steps they're taking to become more resilient that could be consistent with moving toward a war footing, but more study needs to be done, and that's what we recommend.
If you look over the longer term, it appears to be the case that China has for some time been doing things that are intended to reduce its vulnerability to pressure, sanctions, technology, export controls, and so on. It is still dependent on the West for certain technologies. It's heavily dependent on the Western markets and the advanced industrial countries. But for some time, they've been working to reduce that dependence because they see it as a source of vulnerability. At the same time, they've been working to maintain the dependence of advanced industrial countries, including the United States, on them, particularly for intermediate goods. But as Commissioner Shriver says, there's also a level of specific steps or preparations that they appear to be taking that have accelerated over the last 5 years or so that are consistent with preparations for war, although we don't reach a judgment as to whether that's in fact the purpose.
Okay, thank you very much for attending and excellent questions. Again, our report is available here, but for everyone else online. And we look forward to seeing Congress take action on these recommendations in the coming year. Thank you.